Welcome to Chronicles of Old Tales. In the grand story of the Middle Ages, a time so often remembered for its kings, its popes, and the armies of men who followed them, some lives burn so brightly they force us to see everything in a new light. These are the people who didn't just live in their time, they defied it. They broke the rules, rewrote the meaning of power, and left behind a legacy that would echo for 1,000 years. This is the story of one such person. A woman who, in an age that demanded female submission, became a commander of armies and a protector of popes. She inherited a dominion that rivaled kingdoms, and with it, held the destiny of Europe in her hands. She was a countess, a strategist, a kingmaker, and a warrior. In an era that expected women to be silent, her voice roared. This is the story of Matilda of Tuscany, the woman they called La Gran Contessa, the Great Countess. It's the story of how she stood against the most powerful man in the Western world, the Holy Roman Emperor himself, and in doing so, changed forever the great struggle between the crown and the cross. Her life is a blistering testament to the fact that true power isn't just inherited. It's forged in the fires of conflict, faith, and an absolutely unbreakable will. Imagine a bitter winter in January of 1077. The most powerful ruler in Christendom, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, is standing in the snow. But he's not a conqueror. He is a beggar. He is barefoot, dressed only in the rough, scratchy wool of a sinner, and he has been shivering for 3 days and 3 nights outside the gates of a stone fortress, pleading for entry. A blizzard rages around him, the perfect image of the political firestorm he himself had started. But he isn't begging at the gates of Rome or some rival king's palace. The master of this castle, the person holding the keys not just to its gates but to Henry's entire future, isn't another monarch or a prince. The one person holding the fates of both the emperor and the pope in her hands is a woman. Inside that fortress, mediating a crisis that was tearing Europe apart, sat Matilda, the Countess of Tuscany. In a world utterly dominated by men, how on earth did she become the ultimate power broker? This is the story of how she got there. The story of the Countess who dared to challenge an empire. To understand Matilda, you have to understand the world she was born into, the chaotic, violent, and fractured landscape of 11th century Italy. This wasn't a unified country. It was a messy patchwork of city-states, ambitious dukes, and ancient families, all caught between two titanic, competing forces, the Papacy in Rome and the Holy Roman Empire to the north. The emperor, a German king, claimed a God-given right to rule over this vast territory, including Italy. But the Pope, the spiritual head of Western Christianity, was beginning to argue for his own supremacy, not just over the church, but over all earthly kings. It was a collision course, a political earthquake waiting to happen. Into this powder keg, around the year 1046, Matilda was born, and she was no ordinary noble. Her father was Boniface III, the Margrave of Tuscany, one of the most powerful and richest vassals of the emperor. Her family, the House of Canossa, controlled a staggering amount of land. From their fortress at Canossa, nestled in the Apennine Mountains, they ruled a huge portion of northern and central Italy, including Tuscany, Lombardy, and Emilia-Romagna. Their lands were the chessboard on which the game between Pope and Emperor would be played, because they controlled the vital mountain passes that connected Germany to Rome. No emperor could be crowned without passing through Canossa lands. No pope could feel safe without their friendship. Her mother was Beatrice of Lorraine, a woman of sharp intellect and political genius, with prestigious links to the imperial family. This heritage placed Matilda at the center of everything, a bridge between the German imperial world and the Italian nobility. But any hope for a peaceful childhood was shattered with brutal speed. In 1052, when Matilda was just 6, her father Boniface was murdered during a hunt, struck down by a poison-tipped arrow. His assassination threw the family's future into chaos. Suddenly, the most strategic territory in Italy was in the hands of a widow and her 3 small children. Tragedy didn't wait long to strike again. Matilda's older brother and sister both died under mysterious circumstances, many suspecting poison, the silent whisper of medieval politics. In just a few short years, Matilda was an orphan and the sole heir to the immense Canossa legacy. Her mother, Beatrice, was nothing if not a survivor. To protect her daughter and their lands, she remarried. this time to her own cousin, Godfrey the Bearded, a powerful but rebellious duke. This was a smart move for them, but it absolutely infuriated the emperor, Henry III. He saw this marriage as a direct threat to his power in Italy. His response was swift and brutal. In 1055, the emperor marched his army into Italy, arrested Beatrice and a 9-year-old Matilda, and dragged them back to Germany as prisoners. For Matilda, this was a lesson she would never forget. She spent a year as a political hostage, witnessing firsthand the absolute and merciless nature of imperial power. She learned that loyalty was a currency that could be spent in an instant, and that to survive, a ruler needed far more than land and a title. She learned that an emperor could be your enemy. After Henry III's death, they were finally released. Back in Italy, Beatrice and Matilda began to rule their lands together. And Matilda received an education almost unheard of for a woman of her time. She was taught to read and write in Latin, the language of law and diplomacy. She learned German and French. And, crucially, she was schooled in military strategy and leadership. This wasn't the education for a girl who would be a pawn in a political marriage. Her mother was forging a ruler. As she grew up, a revolutionary idea was sweeping out of Rome. A fiery monk named Hildebrand of Savannah was leading a movement to reform the church. He wanted to stamp out corruption like simony, the buying and selling of church offices. But his most radical goal was to end the practice of lay investiture. For centuries, kings and emperors had the power to invest new bishops and abbots, giving them the ring and staff that symbolized their holy office. In reality, this meant they controlled who got the most powerful and wealthy jobs in the church. Bishops weren't just holy men. They were feudal lords who controlled huge estates and even armies. For the emperors, appointing loyal bishops was essential to controlling their empire. But for the reformers, this was a spiritual crime, a secular king interfering in God's domain. They believed only the Pope had the right to appoint the church's leaders. This was the heart of the Investiture controversy, a titanic struggle over the soul of Europe, a battle to draw the line between the power of the priest, *sacerdotium*, and the power of the king, *regnum*. In 1073, the architect of this revolution, the monk Hildebrand, was elected Pope Gregory VII. He and Matilda had known each other for years. He was a close friend and trusted advisor to her mother. A deep bond of respect and shared faith formed between the new pope and the young countess. Gregory saw in Matilda a deeply pious and uniquely powerful ally. Matilda saw in Gregory a spiritual father leading a righteous cause that spoke to her soul. This alliance would soon become the foundation of the church's resistance. The clash with the new emperor, Henry IV, came quickly. Henry was young, arrogant, and determined to show everyone who was in charge. He continued to appoint his own bishops in Italy, openly defying the Pope. In 1075, Pope Gregory dropped a political bombshell, the Dictatus Papae, a stunning declaration of papal supremacy. It claimed the Pope had the power to depose emperors and to release subjects from their oaths of loyalty to an unjust king. For a ruler like Henry IV, who believed he was chosen by God, this wasn't a challenge, it was a declaration of war. In 1076, Henry gathered his German bishops at the Synod of Worms, where they declared Pope Gregory deposed. Henry's letter to the Pope was dripping with venom. He addressed him not as Pope, but as Hildebrand, at present not Pope but false monk, and ended with the chilling command, I, Henry, king by the grace of God, with all of my bishops, say to you, come down, to be damned throughout the ages. Gregory's response was an act of political thunder never before seen in Christendom. He excommunicated the emperor, but he went further. He stripped Henry of his right to rule, and, most importantly, he absolved all of Henry's subjects from the oaths of loyalty they had sworn to him. The Pope's decree was clear. I deny to King Henry the government of the whole kingdom of the Germans and of Italy. I absolve all Christians from the bond of any oath that they have made or shall make to him, and I forbid anyone to serve him as king. Overnight, the political world was shattered. The excommunication gave every rebellious duke in Germany the legal and moral excuse they had been waiting for. Henry's power, which had seemed so absolute, simply vanished. He was isolated, cornered, and facing the total collapse of his kingdom. He had only one choice left: He had to beg the Pope for forgiveness. And the Pope, as fate would have it, was traveling to meet with the German princes. His protector and host on that journey was Matilda of Tuscany. Hearing that Henry was approaching, and fearing it was a trap, Matilda advised the Pope to take refuge in her most formidable fortress, the castle of Canossa. The stage was now set for one of the most incredible showdowns in history. Henry IV's journey to Canossa was an act of pure desperation. With his enemies blocking the main Alpine passes, he was forced to take a brutal winter route over Mont Cenis. Chronicles describe a nightmarish crossing, with the king and his family having to be slid down icy slopes by guides. He finally arrived at Canossa on January 25, 1077, not as a conquering emperor, but as a broken penitent. Inside the castle were the three people who would decide his fate: Pope Gregory VII, still suspicious of Henry's motives; Hugh of Cluny, a powerful abbot and Henry's own godfather; and the lady of the castle herself, Matilda. She was the host, the Pope's protector, and the mediator in this epic clash of wills. She was related to Henry by blood, but her soul belonged to Gregory's cause. She was at the absolute epicenter of European politics. At first, Gregory refused to even see the emperor. He had been betrayed by Henry before and saw this as a cynical political stunt, not genuine repentance. So Henry began his penance. For 3 days, he stood in the outer courtyard, barefoot in the freezing snow, wearing nothing but a thin woolen tunic, fasting from dawn until dusk. The symbolism was staggering. The most powerful secular ruler on earth was humbling himself before the spiritual authority of the Church. The Holy Roman Empire was literally left out in the cold. Inside, Matilda and Abbot Hugh begged the Pope to show mercy. They were moved by the sight of the emperor's profound humiliation. Finally, on the third day, January 28th, Gregory relented. The gates creaked open. Henry IV was allowed to enter, where he fell to his knees before the Pope, weeping and begging for forgiveness. Gregory, acting as a priest rather than a politician, could not refuse a sinner. He lifted the excommunication. Later that day, the Pope, the Emperor, and the Countess shared communion, sealing the reconciliation. On the surface, it looked like a total victory for the papacy. The image of the kneeling emperor would forever symbolize the Church's power. But the reality was far more complicated. Henry had gotten exactly what he wanted. The ban was lifted, his authority was restored, and the rebellion in Germany lost its momentum. He had brilliantly outmaneuvered the Pope, forcing his hand. Gregory, on the other hand, had demonstrated the spiritual power of his office, but he'd lost his political leverage. The walk to Canossa wasn't the end of the war. It was just the end of the beginning. The fight was about to escalate, from a war of decrees to a war of swords. And Matilda of Tuscany was about to step into its heart, no longer as a mediator, but as a warrior. The peace forged at Canossa was a lie, and it shattered almost instantly. Henry IV, his power restored, returned to Germany, crushed the rebellion, and immediately began plotting his revenge. In 1080, Gregory excommunicated him for a second time. But this time, Henry was ready. He had his German nobles in line and many Italian bishops on his side. He held a council, had Gregory declared deposed again, and elected his own pope, the antipope Clement III. The Cold War between church and state had turned into a hot, bloody civil war. Italy was the battlefield. And this was the moment Matilda of Tuscany shed the role of diplomat and fully became a military commander. Her absolute loyalty to Pope Gregory was the bedrock of the papal war effort. She made a decision of staggering piety and political importance. She donated all of her personal ancestral lands to the papacy to be used for the cause. She was no longer just an ally of the Church. She was its greatest champion, committing everything she had to the fight. Henry IV's response was furious and predictable. He declared Matilda an outlaw, a traitor guilty of high treason, and proclaimed all her lands and titles forfeit. But a declaration in Germany means nothing without an army in Italy. So, in 1081, Henry marched south, determined to destroy Matilda and put his antipope on St. Peter's throne. Years of brutal, grinding warfare followed. While some historians debate whether Matilda personally wielded a sword in battle, there is no question she was the strategic commander of her armies. This fact alone scandalized her enemies and inspired her allies, who called her a virago, a woman with the courage and spirit of a man. Her enemies, of course, spread slanderous rumors, trying to discredit her with politically motivated stories of an affair with Pope Gregory. Matilda's military genius lay in asymmetry and attrition. Knowing she was often outnumbered, she refused to give Henry the large, decisive battle he wanted. Instead, she used her knowledge of the terrain, fortifying her castles and turning the Apennine Mountains into a fortress. She bled his army with ambushes, harassment, and by controlling the strategic roads, frustrating him and making him look weak. But there were devastating losses. In October 1080, her army suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Volta Mantovana. Many of her supporters, seeing the imperial tide rising, abandoned her. Cities that were once hers fell to the emperor. By 1084, it looked like Henry had won. He marched on Rome, besieged it, and entered in triumph. Pope Gregory VII could only watch from his refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo, as Henry had his own pope, Clement III, crown him Holy Roman Emperor in St. Peter's Basilica. This was Matilda's darkest hour. Her pope was a prisoner, her armies were beaten, her lands were overrun. But even then, she did not break. Gregory was eventually rescued by his Norman allies, but died in exile a year later, famously lamenting, "I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity. Therefore, I die in exile." Matilda, however, fought on. On July 2nd, 1084, just months after Henry's glorious coronation, she orchestrated a brilliant surprise counterattack. In a daring night raid at the Battle of Sorbara, her forces routed the emperor's Lombard allies, capturing their leaders and winning a stunning victory. It was a clear and bloody message. Even with the Pope in exile and Rome in his hands, the emperor was not safe. The Countess of Tuscany was not defeated. The death of Pope Gregory in 1085 could have ended everything. But for Matilda, the fight was far from over. She became the military and financial anchor for Gregory's successors, Pope Victor III, and especially Pope Urban II. Her court was a sanctuary for clergy fleeing the emperor's wrath. She continued to fund the cause, at one point even melting down the treasures of her own castle at Canossa to send money to Rome. The war raged on. To create a new, powerful anti-imperial front, Matilda, now in her early 40s, made another shocking political move. In 1089, urged on by Pope Urban II, she married again. Her new husband was Welf V, the 17-year-old heir to the mighty Duchy of Bavaria. Can you imagine the court gossip? A 43-year-old countess marrying a teenager. But this wasn't about love. It was pure strategy, uniting the two most powerful families resisting the emperor north and south of the Alps. It showed Matilda's ruthless dedication. She would use any weapon, war, diplomacy, even a scandalous marriage, to win. And it worked. The alliance forced Henry IV to invade Italy yet again in 1090. At first, he was successful, but Matilda's mind was sharpest under pressure. In 1092, when Henry's army besieged her ancestral fortress of Canossa, she engineered another masterful counteroffensive that led to a humiliating defeat for the imperial army. But her most devastating blow was yet to come. It wasn't a military victory, but a masterpiece of psychological and dynastic warfare. She began to welcome and support members of Henry IV's own family who turned against him. First, she gave shelter to his estranged wife, Praxedes, who fled the emperor's court with horrifying stories of abuse. Then, in 1093, Matilda did the unthinkable. She encouraged and actively supported the rebellion of Henry's own eldest son and heir, Conrad, against his father. Conrad's rebellion shattered the imperial camp and was a crippling personal blow to Henry IV. The emperor who had humbled popes was now being undone by his own son, with his oldest enemy pulling the strings. Utterly defeated and demoralized, Henry IV retreated from Italy in 1097, never to return. He had failed. He could not break the will of the Countess of Tuscany. Her marriage to the young Welf V, its purpose served, was dissolved a few years later. In her final years, Matilda ruled alone, consolidating her power, funding the construction of over 100 churches, and patronizing the new law school at Bologna. In a final, extraordinary twist, she eventually reconciled with the new emperor, Henry V, the other son who had ultimately succeeded the father she'd fought for so long. At a meeting in 1111, Henry V, recognizing her immense and undeniable power, formally acknowledged her as imperial vicar over Italy. It was the ultimate admission of her status. The empire she had battled for decades was finally forced to recognize her as a power in her own right. Matilda of Tuscany died on July 24, 1115, at the age of 69. She had outlived Pope Gregory VII, Emperor Henry IV, and nearly every other major player in the Great Investiture controversy. She died without a direct heir, and her will, which left her vast lands to the papacy, became a new source of conflict between popes and emperors for generations to come. One final, posthumous reminder of her central role in their struggle. Matilda's story is a powerful reminder that history is filled with giants who refuse to fit into the boxes we build for them. If you found the story of the warrior Countess compelling, and we hope you did, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to Chronicles of Old Tales for more stories about the forgotten heroes and hidden titans of the past. And let us know in the comments, are there other historical figures whose stories are just waiting to be told? Your suggestions help us decide where to explore next. So, what is the final legacy of Matilda of Tuscany? Was she a saint or a sinner? A patriot or a power broker? The truth is, she was all of those things. She was more than just a countess who fought an emperor. She was a fulcrum on which the history of the Middle Ages turned. Her relentless military, financial, and political support was absolutely essential to the papacy. Without her, it's highly doubtful the Gregorian reforms would have survived Henry IV's wrath. She was, quite literally, the shield of the papacy. Her resistance to the empire also created the space for the independent city-states of Italy, Florence, Lucca, Siena, to grow, laying the cultural groundwork for the glories of the Renaissance. And finally, her legacy as a woman of power is simply immense. In a time when noble women were treated like property, passed between families to seal an alliance, Matilda was a commander, a diplomat, and a kingmaker who wielded power with a skill few men of her era could ever hope to match. So great was her legend that in the 17th century, her remains were moved from Mantua to Rome. Today, Matilda of Tuscany, La Gran Contessa, lies in a magnificent tomb inside St. Peter's Basilica itself, one of only a handful of women ever granted such an honor. Her presence there is a silent, eternal tribute to the countess who fought an emperor, defended a pope, and proved that in the iron-willed world of the Middle Ages, the most powerful force in the world wasn't a crown or a sword, but a single, unbreakable will.